Okay, we are in the Native American Literature unit of American Literature. Um, and this PowerPoint is the introduction to oral tradition. So a lot of cultures, especially hundreds of years ago, did not have books or websites to pass along written information. They did it orally, which means with your mouth. So they would have designated people in their cultures who would memorize stories and then tell them to everybody. And then the next generation that came along, there would be the certain person who was the storyteller, and then they would learn the stories and tell them to the next generation. Okay. You don't have to write this journal, but I just want you to think about these questions. Nowadays, in 2020, how do we tell stories? There are many different ways. Think about Snapchat, stories on Instagram or Facebook, the news, the telephone, email, face-to-face, movies. Those are all ways that we tell stories. How is this different from past generations? Think about that. Think about even 100 years ago in the 1920s. They didn't have computers. They didn't even have TVs, you guys. They listened to the radio. They wrote letters. Okay, so how is it the same and how is it different? Well, even 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, stories can be the same because we're still humans. We still talk to each other. We still tell stories with our mouths. The difference is really just technology. Okay. All right, so Native American history, just a little background. Native Americans were here centuries before Europeans, aka white people. There were hundreds of unique nations, and nations are also known as tribes, right? It wasn't just like a land filled with Native Americans. There was little like cities, if you will, or tribes of people, and they all believed different things. So each had its own history and tradition, but they needed a way to preserve the past, right? By telling stories. So oral tradition is a community's cultural and historical traditions passed down by word of mouth or example from one generation to another without written instruction. So it's not a book. There are people who specifically memorize their culture's stories and tell them, kind of like actors, okay? For Native Americans, creation myths weren't always written down. They began over 100 years ago, right? Maybe even 200. These stories were passed down by families and in ceremonies. And examples of these stories are lullabies, ballads, and folk tales. So what we're going to be reading are myths. And a myth is a traditional story passed down through generations that explains why the world is the way it is. Okay, so either how the world was created, or events that usually resulted from the action of supernatural beings, right? So things that we can't just explain. Myths usually contain supernatural elements. They often explain the unexplainable. Major role in stories is often played by animals. And also, myths usually have a moral lesson. So they teach you something about right and wrong. These stories also use something called archetypes. And archetypes is a pattern of story or a type of character that is used often in different stories throughout all cultures over the ages, right? So there's the hero, the villain. Those are archetypes. All cultures. Sorry. Hey! All cultures have myths, but often that culture will not see their story as a myth, but they see it as a fact. Okay. All right, so there are many functions of a myth, and that just means there are many purposes of why myths exist. The 4 functions are: 1, mystical. So this enables or allows human beings to accept the burdens of life, like death. You know, these stories give us a reason and an explanation for why that has to happen. Number 2, cosmological. So these myths explain the unknowns of the universe. Number 3, sociological. So mythologies help maintain social norms. They show people how they should act. And number 4 is psychological. So they support us through the changes of life, right? Growing old, having babies, dying, things like that. All right. So this is the PowerPoint on the introduction to oral tradition. Once you are done with this video, go ahead and start reading the 3 myths that I have posted, or there's another video where I'm reading them if you want to follow along that way. Bye.